something is wrong, and it's time to stand up. You are listening to The John Age Show.
Trust no one. Trust no one. Trust no one.
You found it. You're here. You're headlong down the runaway train that is the Anomic Age, and I'm your host, John Age. Happy to be back with you once again in the not-so-wee hours of the PM today. Got a great guest coming up. We got none other than Mr. Anton Chaitkin coming up in just a moment, but before we get into that, please check out anomicage.com. You can find all the shows, all the audio, all the video. The shortened information breakdown segments that I put out several times a week are there too. The iPhone app, the Android app, that's all for free, as well as the free newsletter there at the bottom. If you're so inclined, I highly recommend becoming a patron or at least making a donation. That's paypal.me/anomicage, patreon.com/anomicage as well. And we got the new Satoshi's links where you can send me, I suppose, little Bitcoin fragments if you're inclined on that one as well. One of the other new links down there is the subscribe by email link. I've found that it's a little bit more user-friendly sometimes than the app, or at least a little bit more reliable. And as always, you can just click unsubscribe anytime you want to unsubscribe to those too. The new social media links, I'm back on Twitter after about a 4-year hiatus. They let me back on there. And on Instagram as of about 3 weeks ago. I think I've already covered this, but I'm not on YouTube anymore, so you won't find anything Anomic Age there, at least not put out by me anyway. So all that, if you're inclined. All right, enough of that. Let's get into what you probably came here for today. Mr. Anton Chaitkin is the son of Jacob Chaitkin, a lawyer who blocked some of Wall Street's sponsorship of Hitler's regime. Anton grew up committed to justice with a strong sense of the realities of power. About 2 years after the JFK assassination, he heard from Lyndon LaRouche. The financiers were shifting America's strategy away from industrial progress towards cheap labor, foreshadowing fascist politics and systematic collapse. An association was formed to defeat those who had brutalized contemporary thought in science, economics, the arts, and philosophy. He's a researcher, a historian, and absolutely an author of several books. Most notably, we'll get into his most recent today, and a second volume is coming forthwith. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's good to be with you. Good to see you.
I mentioned this a little bit before we got on here live, but I'm so excited that Christopher Fogarty put us together. He mentioned you highly last we talked and mentioned your book. And I got to go by anything that gentleman says. He's a great researcher and author as well. So thanks for Christopher for putting us together.
Yeah, Chris Fogarty's own book is terrific contribution to straightening out the history of our country as well as the problem of the British Empire in the world and what they did in the genocide that they called the famine of the 1840s in Ireland. It's a top-notch book.
Absolutely. Well, I'll kind of probably start at a selfish way because I always am interested in how people like yourself got into what you're into. Author of several books, researcher, historian. What led you down this path? I know, as mentioned there in your bio, your father and his career sort of sparked a lot of that interest, I'm thinking. But how'd you get here?
A lot of what my father did was before I was born. I had to look into it. But I grew up out west in the LA area, and my family were, they were very bright people, and they were committed to making the world better. My father had been in U.S. Army intelligence during World War II. He spoke both German and Russian. He grew up in Latvia, came here as a young man before the Russian Revolution. But the ideas of justice were impressed on me by what I read and what my friends talked about, and including the spirit of human progress that you get from the arts when they're beautiful, not the degenerate attack on beauty that came in at the really, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. But Beethoven and Bach, and in my mind as a child, I was able to equate the striving for the betterment of humanity and of justice with these beautiful works by men of compassion and genius. And I saw that compassion and genius go together all throughout history. And I was able to study these things much later on in the 1960s. As you mentioned, I met LaRouche in New York, and we formed an organization with some other people, and we were committed to looking into all of the wrong that, especially in the 20th century, had been systematically put on every sort of academic area, in science, of course, in philosophy, and turning people away from the idea of progress. This is just after Kennedy's assassination. So it was in that context that I and some friends of mine studied, and I began doing independent work on, found the resources in the libraries and archives to really do independent work on history, to look at the two sides in our country's history. And I think that my greatest surprise and happiness came from the realization that progress, which we haven't known really, I think, in the United States in a fundamental way since Kennedy was murdered, but that progress has to do with greater control over nature through scientific breakthroughs, through skilled work, through families that come up that are, the nuclear family, which is based on a productive role for the parents, and hope that the children will have an even greater productive role. This is all strategy of our country from its founding, this idea of progress. And so I've been able to study this fight between the two sides in American history. And in the volume 1 of this book, it's sort of my lifelong dream to do this book. I've done other books before this, but this is something I've been studying directly since the 1970s, the Industrial Revolution and how the U.S. was industrialized. And really the American leaders at the time of our revolution were combating a British Empire decision at that time to not allow any other country to get industry. The British had just gotten it. And it wasn't even the imperialists of Britain who developed that. It was developed by humanitarian people who were pro-American. They were in Benjamin Franklin's circle. So Britain got these inventions, and the empire said, we are going to deny them to any other country. No country will be allowed to develop industry. So our founding fathers, the nationalists in Franklin's circle and in George Washington's circle, they said, we are, on behalf of our people in America and on behalf of the world's people, are seeking to industrialize the United States and to go from backwardness to modern industrial powers. And this is at the heart of the right to rise as a people. This is the central issue in world history in modern times. You have this in the USA, you have it in Africa. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. And this goes back to my sense of justice as a child. In Nigeria, they just built a deep water port. China helped them do it. There's a dam called the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Huge electrification project. China helped them do that. Ghana and some other countries have nuclear power capabilities for nuclear energy, for electricity. Russia has been helping them do that. The United States in the past was the leader of this kind of initiative for the world's progress. Now we have elected to make Russia and China our enemies when the United States no longer develops itself or helps develop other countries. But in fact, in absolutely provable fact, in depth and detail, the people who had this generous impulse to aid in the development of other countries' rise were the people who made this country powerful. They built the industries. They fought the necessary wars like the Civil War to keep our power as a nation growing. And also they were completely opposed to foreign wars. They wanted a strong defense, but you don't go off seeking war. You make your country powerful in a community of nations, each one sovereign and governing itself. But what's the fundamental issue? The right to rise. Everything is pivots on that. So that's what I came to, what I've been able to. I'm sort of the expert in this one field of these two sides, the American economic nationalists and what they believed in, what they accomplished, versus the British Empire and their faction, which is now the Anglo-American establishment, which is quite wicked and it has nothing to do with American interests. They're opposed to America's national existence, really, or certainly America's interests. That's the fundamental divide in U.S. history.
Man, there's so many different avenues to go down with this. I mean, before we go deep into the pool, I was just, while you were talking, maybe go shallow into the pool, but you mentioned sort of the 1960s as that Rubicon where we just jumped off the cliff, so to speak.
That's right.
And I see so many of these memes sometimes going back to the Jetsons of the 1960s where they were saying, by 2020, we were supposed to have flying cars and all this great technology, and it looks like we haven't hardly moved the ball upfield. I mean, that being said, we do have computers, internet, and all that, but as far as making things better, I mean, we still got these huge potholes out here. We have crumbling infrastructure, and we got our would-be leaders like Barack Obama going to these third world nations saying, shame on you for having air conditioning and refrigeration and technology. I'm going to jump on my Learjet and fly back to the good world while you folks keep living in some sort of bizarro world museum exhibit in Africa and all across the third world.
Well, the last president in a succession going back to George Washington, you had Lincoln in the same line, you had FDR. When people think of certain policies, they don't think of what I'm getting at here, and that is Kennedy, in his short presidency, was passionately devoted to the rise of Africa in particular. He was when he was a senator before president, he was the chairman of the Africa subcommittee, the Committee on Foreign Relations, and he was an advocate for nationalism in Black Africa and in Arab Africa. And he said the communists are getting ahead of us in presenting themselves as the friends of African liberation. Kennedy said that our interests and the interests of every other country are the same. So these countries were crushed by British and French and Dutch colonialism. Why should we take the side of those colonialists? They're our enemies. They're the enemies of mankind. And so if we don't want to see the world engulfed by revolution and by chaos, the United States has to resume the role we had. And so the first foreign head of state to visit the White House when Kennedy was president was Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana. And they worked out a joint project, which Nkrumah wanted to do, to build a great dam in Ghana. It was the engineer for that was the Kaiser family. That you remember the Kaiser Steelworks and the car and so forth. So this is a great industrial family, but the United States helped finance the dam, and this was to electrify, to build a great reservoir for hydroelectricity to electrify West Africa. And in England and Holland, what is now the center of the it's Davos people. Then it was Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Just after Kennedy was inaugurated as president, they started a new organization called the World Wildlife Fund to attack Kennedy's agenda of resuming the industrialization of America and helping other countries to industrialize. Kennedy's project for getting back on the track for the USA focused on solving the problems in the world as well as our own. One of the great programs was to build nuclear power plants that would have the capability of desalinating seawater, and to have these as joint projects between countries that were otherwise fighting each other: India and Pakistan, Israel and the Arabs, the U.S. and Russia, U.S. and Mexico. You get fresh water where you need it. The world's covered with water. Just move it where you need it, right? With canals and dams and desalination. But also you need electricity. The U.S. was the primary agency for bringing electricity to the world. Thomas Edison had partners all over the world. We brought modern times to much of the world, and our opponents, who are now the Eastern and Anglo-American establishment, were opposed to that program of the United States of America. That is the United States of America. That's the way it was looked at in the time of Lincoln. You know, there was a book called From the Earth to the Moon, written by Jules Verne around the time of the U.S. Civil War. And it was about how people in a U.S. Army arsenal made this giant cannon to shoot a projectile to the moon with people in it. And the theme of it was keying off what America had done to win the Civil War and then start up all these great industries. America can do anything. Americans are so ingenious and hardworking, and their system protects and promotes industry and science so that they can accomplish anything. Sorry. So that's the United States. That's our unique role in the world. And again, this goes against conservative and liberal ideas because they have become soured. You have the idea of private enterprise. If you make a private enterprise in an environment where the nation is trying to accomplish great things, you are likely, and you're likely to get money for it as well if you need sponsorship or something, but you're likely to move in the direction of doing something that's really for the benefit of the country as well as to make yourself money. And that's the kind of people who have built our industries. No basic American industries were built by Wall Street or by City of London financiers. And in considering this whole history and getting the facts on it, there's a certain foundation of knowledge that you have to understand this. I think we had an exchange of ideas, a few days ago on this one point. The United States was founded at a particular time. There was something going on of very great importance at that time, which is that the British had just, as I said, they had just gotten this breakthrough where they had steam engines and canals, and they had suddenly become more modern and with great powers. And the United States needed that. That was the context. So there was a fight about that within the United States about whether we should industrialize in order to have a country at all, in order to defend ourselves, in order to have the power to survive, in order to get the backup for a military and the power of a nation. Jefferson, who was originally a revolutionary and on the side of American independence, switched sides on this question. And when he was disappointed as governor of Virginia, and his government sort of fled from the British when they invaded Virginia. And this is after he had written the Declaration of Independence. So he was given a chance by the elite slave owner aristocrats of Virginia to get back into politics. His reputation was bad at that time. If he would be in politics as a representative of Southern interests. And that's how he started his opposition to the nationalists in the United States. He went to France as an ambassador to replace Benjamin Franklin. And while he was over there, he got in with the representatives of British Empire thinking in economics and philosophy. Some of it portrayed as radical. In fact, the British had at that time a pioneering adventure in stirring up anarchism and terrorism and radicalism of all kinds in France to destroy France. And they wrecked the French Revolution by British agentry. This was part of the regime that came into power in England during the American Revolution under Lord Shelburne. He was briefly prime minister. So Shelburne, who was for free trade for other countries, that means no other country should interfere with trade for their own benefit. Jefferson adopted these British ideas, even though he was himself posing as anti-British. And he had many ideas. He's a very conflicted man. But he attacked Hamilton when Hamilton called for the industrialization of the United States with government backing. He wasn't calling for socialism. He wasn't calling for dictatorship. He wanted to have the United States change from a backward country into a modern industrial power. And no country has ever done that without government backing. Government doesn't own the industries, but they have to be on the side of their own country.
Yeah.
That's protectionism. That's many other things. It's not a trade war. Jefferson opposed this and lied about Hamilton, just straight out lied. He started a party attacking Washington and Hamilton. Then the people opposed to Jefferson, who were not really friends of Washington and Hamilton, but were the Boston Brahmins, these rich importers and people in with the British. They said Jefferson is an atheist, he's a communist, he's this and that. They lied about Jefferson. They formed a two-party system. And they were supposed to be the conservatives, and Jefferson was supposed to be the radical. Does that sound familiar?
It does. Sounds pretty spot on.
It was a rotten two-party system. And in that environment, you get foreign agents like Aaron Burr and Albert Gallatin who come in. And the first attempt by the Americans to industrialize was squashed. It was not until we ended up about 50 years behind Britain on industry. It was not until the 1820s that the second generation of nationalists built the first great industries. What were our inventions that were deliberately done as national projects by people who wanted to develop the country?
Mm-hmm.
The iron industry, the coal industry. We had no coal mine, no commercial coal mines before this. Canals and railroads. These are all new inventions in America. And so then we also, at that point, were helping two other countries in particular, Germany and Russia, to advance. Did we like their governments? No, that's little to do with it. Their governments will improve as they get into modern times and have communication with the rest of the world. It's not our business to tell other people or them to tell us what kind of government we're going to have. But we can be friends and promote the common interests of mankind. That's not globalism. That is a brotherhood of human beings. Now, this is where today's people who are locked into this culture war have to pay attention to history, because the British Empire was based on their justification for absolute cruelty, looting the rest of the world, complete racialism.
Mm-hmm.
And they one of their bases was a city called Geneva in Switzerland. They were Calvinists, supposedly. And between Geneva and Amsterdam and London, the city of London financiers and the financiers in these other places, they went on this supposedly Calvinist point of view. But it was actually anti-Christian in the extreme. The idea was that if you have an idea of Christian morality in economics or in statecraft, you're a fool. You're going against nature. Nature is simply savagery. And really, that completely takes God or purpose out of the universe. And of course, then the universe itself, in a completely unscientific way, is declared to be senseless and without order, in which you can't do any science. But this was the radical new philosophy of the British Empire, and it became the philosophy of our ruling economists in the Anglo-American establishment, that economics is simply self-interest. Well, does the self-interest and the national interest go together? Yes, they have to go together. Yeah. The interest of one human being is absolutely tied to the interests of everybody else. And in a neighborhood, you want the whole neighborhood to flourish, right? That's how you have a peaceful neighborhood. So these were the ideas of our founding fathers, and they're not the ideas of any party today. I'm sorry. But you have to get an idea of the way they thought. And the most efficient way that I found to do that is to look at the great accomplishments in our history and see the kind of thinking that the people who did those things, what were they trying to accomplish? Who built the first steel mills? It was these economic nationalists, passionate supporters of the Union in the Civil War. Many of them abolitionists, but not anti-union abolitionists like in Boston. So these are humanitarians. They were also some of in the private sector. They were rich, often, and there are a number of people that are pretty much lost to history that were absolutely central to the strategy making for our country. I'm currently, of course, centering on Henry C. Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, who was the great economist for Lincoln and for the founding of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And around him, there were people like the Pennsylvania Railroad and various other industries to make locomotives and to do a lot of the steel industry. The petroleum industry was started by them, not Rockefeller. He jumped into it to try to take over. Nothing of importance was built up in the United States by Wall Street or by these transatlantic financiers. And they were usually allied with the Southern slave owners and the British imperialists to try to stop American progress and loot the country. And that's still going on. And they form a lot of the radical movements on their own terms without getting at any truth. Like the story of the New York Times for the 1619 Project about slavery. Well, slavery was a great crime. What was it? It was an imperial crime. How did the slaves get out of Africa? How were the slave traders able to get the slaves from Africa? Well, the British had a strategy, and this is true for the other weaker countries, that they would absolutely prevent machinery or science or skills for work to get into Africa. Because if they had industry in Africa, then the value of the people of Africa would go up, and nobody would sell their fellow men if they were more valuable as workers in modern industry. So this is suppressing the rise of the country. We know that in Virginia and Georgia, under slavery, as it got worse and worse towards the Civil War, they forbid any kind of technological improvement, even though the people wanted it in those states. They wanted canals, they wanted railroads. So you had this elite that saw their strategy when they were exporting cotton to England and importing goods. They didn't want any American industry at all, but especially in the South. They wanted no progress, and they wanted everybody to be as stupid as possible around them so they could continue to wield power in their little empire. And then what led to the Civil War is they said, well, let's build a big empire for slavery. They went west, they went into Mexico, they went to Cuba. And it was the people who were trying to get a slave empire that brought on the Civil War.
And this is so crazy. But I think the historical angle is so important to all this, because I think what I just call the cult of academia and their manipulation of the history or their rewriting of the history has changed the American culture so much and has really just furthered this divide and conquer mechanism, because what you just said is probably just as foreign as Pluto to most of the average American. And I think that just furthers this sort of, well, they did it. It was those evil rich guys, I tell you, that ran slavery, that pushed American imperialism and all this, that, and the other. And I think all that, from the right and the left, because the left gets that sort of very Marxist-Leninist narrative of the evil white Americans, and then the right gets sort of the other, I don't want to say like glossed over, but very, very protected history of some of the founding fathers and some of that, like you just mentioned with, with Thomas Jefferson. I think is so often left out. I think most people on the right would lionize Jefferson as always doing the right thing and all these great attributes, which he highly deserves, most all of them. But I think a lot of that history is sort of left out. I mean, just from my own vantage point, trying to get my daughter some really old history books, I went back into some late 1800s history books, and the more I learned, the more I'm looking at even those as being very, very glossed over, very idyllic. I don't think it was quite as cut and dry as most of the Americans. Even the horrible history that most of the Americans get taught, I think even that has been so adulterated that it just furthers this divide.
More adulterated. At a very early time, the universities in the United States were the enemy had a great deal influence, and people who were not in favor of the interests of the U.S. population and the U.S. as a nation, promulgated in the universities this idea of free trade and a philosophy that really, when they talked about human rights, they narrowed this down. What's the fundamental human right? To me, the fundamental human right is that a person, every person, has the right to be treated as a human being. And that means the reality of that is that you have the right to have a decent life and decent opportunities. And if there are conditions that stop that, you have the right to have your own government that helps to create those conditions that encourages the possibility that you can have a success in your life. So we've learned in recent times to put up with basically abuse by large corporations, by the government, by the conditions of life. People now don't have demonstrations or rallies or debates. They take these problems out on themselves or their families. They take drugs. They commit suicide. They go and shoot a bunch of people. But what is the right? You know, many conservatives have demonized Franklin Roosevelt without really understanding this progression of history. So he had the notion of the four freedoms that he put out at the beginning of World War II. First is freedom of religion. Today that's sort of out the window because people don't have respect for religion, your own or someone else's. Mm-hmm. Then you have freedom of speech. This is, if you were kicked off of YouTube, I don't have to say too much more. But deeper than that, where's the debate on what the U.S. is doing in the world or in our own country? Yeah. That freedom of speech isn't just your right to say something without being arrested. It's the possibility that you could have a conversation with other people that would actually mean something.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Going back to kind of what you were, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll just throw this out there really quickly, but kind of going back to what you were saying earlier with the 1960s, I mean, for better or worse, that's kind of the last time we saw any major demonstrations. Certainly for things like peace. I mean, we're on the precipice of war with a global superpower, and the streets are empty. I mean, there should be protests saying 60s, we don't want to go to war, we don't want to die. I mean, peace should be one of those goals, you know?
Yeah, in the 60s, the peace movement was interfered with by this Anglo-American establishment to, quote, radicalize it, unquote, and to change it into just chaos, to make, hippie culture instead of considering the strategy for the world to live together and to prosper and to thrive by having the U.S. best powers and qualities be improved. Martin Luther King was for the industrialization of the South and the industrialization of Africa. And he believed in the Constitution, and so then actually at Yale, the guy who's head of the Ford Foundation, and then went to Yale, Bundy, paid for a kind of black nationalism to replace Martin Luther King's ideas. After King was murdered or right around the same time, King was murdered for speaking out against the war in Vietnam. But King was not against the United States. He was for the development of our powers as a civilization. Then you have the other two freedoms of the four freedoms are freedom from want. That means you have the right to have a decent standard of living. And that means all the countries have to cooperate to develop that. No nation is our enemy as a nation. Some movement might be an enemy, some crazy terrorist movement where they take drugs and shoot everybody. That's not a nation. They may be an enemy, but that's a police problem. But the nations have the same interest in providing the means of a decent standard of living, freedom from want. And then the last is freedom from fear. We are now pushing, that is we, when I say we, I mean the Anglo-American, this complex of oligarchs is pushing for increasing war with Russia and China. And it's immediately so dangerous with Russia because it's aiming at Third World War. That's the aim. Why? Why not? First of all, why not, when the communist regime fell, why not make friends with Russia? What's our differences with them? We don't like their government. Well, they had a succession of governments. Which one is it that you didn't like? Did we like any government that was there in the past? Is there any government in the world that's really that terrific? That's not the issue, right? So freedom from fear is a basic human right. We have the right not to be terrorized by war. And that is where a family person, the parent of a family, looks at their own children and their spouse and they say, I'm responsible and we're together responsible for the future of this family. And I have to see to it that there is a stable and prospering world in which my family can thrive. This is the attitude of a statesman that we need right now for the country. We have to have calm, reasoned, common interest measures taken that promote stability and confidence between countries. If we did that and had the projects like Kennedy did, like Edison did, like Lincoln did. Lincoln was reaching out to all kinds of countries. It's amazing. I'll have this in my second volume. I've written a lot about it. You can get it on the internet. But if we had that program, a country like Iran, for example, do you think the Iranian people are all stupid? Do you think they're all crazed by some religious ideas? They are jealous of their national sovereignty, as well as whatever other problems they have. So, if we had this idea of promoting a stable, prosperous region, then we would have the people of this and every other region on our side, and that's our safety. And that's what we have done in the past when we were promoting our own national interest, which we don't promote today.
And I hate to keep coming back to this point as this delineated line, but I think it's so important because you can probably speak to this prior to 1960 from your book here, but I see since 1960 we've seen this constant ramp up of fear. And it's obviously been used as a pressure point to further divide and to get the slaves to do what they want. I mean, they know if they can push the fear button, everybody's brain will get into that lower state of fight or flight, and they'll just be more compliant. But, I mean, just looking at since 1960 or since the assassination of JFK, I mean, we've seen the assassination of everybody. From JFK to RFK to Lenin. I'm missing several in between there, but I mean, we've seen that as a fear. I mean, we've seen the war in Vietnam and them just sort of rolling the dead bodies out on the live 5 o'clock news, and then we flash forward to the gas shortages, the Iran-Contra. We got those weapons of mass destruction, the 9/11, and now a spooky virus, and now we're on the precipice of nuclear war. So, I mean, that fear has been just killing us. And I don't think we saw that in those early years, the early years of our country, even all the way up into that assassination of JFK. I mean, of course, we saw World War I, II in Korea, but we had a whole lot of, it seemed to be peace in between there. I could be wrong. I mean, I wasn't alive, but I mean, from everything I heard, there wasn't this fear-mongering every few days of this newest thing's going to get you. You better watch out,
We didn't, I mean, we've had always crimes committed on our behalf as a country and on the behalf of civilization, really. We, with the American Indians, with black people brought from Africa, with other people, immigrants were mistreated in the slums. But when we made progress, the people who did these, and the inventors, the statesmen who were promoting this program, had an excitement about the possibility that man, with his unlimited creativity, which you see in a child who is loved, could do anything. And that was America's special gift to the world. And so they were happy people, despite there was fear. There was a great deal of fear in many times, and terrible things happening. A lot of the things that you can trace to very specific problems of the two sides. For example, how come the Indians were chased out of their land in a brutal way? At certain times, that was not happening. George Washington was a great advocate for peace and justice. You had this greed for land that's associated with the Southern slave owner elite, and who wanted to keep the people in the South at a certain point, ignorant. So they said, oh, there's gold on the land of the Cherokees. This was where you had the driving out from the homeland for people who we had a treaty with for peaceful existence. They were doing agriculture like their ancestors did. They were advanced. So I'm saying that Kennedy, who revived this earlier idea, FDR the same, Lincoln revived the American Revolution. What's in their minds? Man is born with a beautiful soul. You don't see that in a 2-year-old. He says no, no, no all the time. But that is there, that beauty of soul. That's our gift from heaven. And it's a gift of creativity to improve the world, to make discoveries of the order of the universe that will allow us to do things on mankind's behalf. And when people understand this and participate in it, they're skilled, and they're given a chance to be skilled, then they are excited by the possibilities, and no fear will overcome them. Man like Franklin was the great leader in this way. He set up he had a secret society called the Junto in Philadelphia. They had to protect it from British imperial snoopers and opponents. But they were dedicated to science and making industries that were actually forbidden by the British on their colonies. And then that was transformed into the American Philosophical Society. Franklin's personal organization became the American Philosophical Society, which was the first organization uniting in the colonies. And they had subcommittees on developing the different industries and canals and things like that. And so this is the point of view that we have. That's how we get out of the fear.
Yeah.
Is you go to this problem-solving way of thinking. Are there problems in the world that could be solved by action for improvement? People were frightened by the whole circumstance of COVID-19, the way the government responded to it, the way all the propaganda. And part of the reaction to that, in my view, was stupid, to say, well, there is no such virus. Well, we had measles before we had polio, and we dealt with those through scientific means. Now, when somebody unfortunately says science, they may mean, taking away everything you have. That's not science. Science is for the improvement of human beings, and it involves national interest. So I'm saying that you look at these problems. For example, in Africa, there are 500 million people without electricity. How is that tolerated? And what could we do about that? Well, why don't we engage in the kind of investigation that would allow us to solve these problems? And we go back to some of the programs we had. We had a program in the 1960s that was aborted for bringing water to the West, called NWAPA, North American Water and Power Association, I think it was. And it was to bring the rivers from the Northwest down to the South on the West Coast. And also you have desalination. Right now we could bring water from Louisiana and the tributaries of the Mississippi. They could be brought easily out to Nevada and California. A lot of the water is just going out into the Gulf. So do some work and solve problems. And do that in conjunction with other countries, and you're solving problems. You cannot solve fear by simply saying that there are powerful, evil men who dominate everything and plan everything. They don't plan everything. They plan some things, but they're crazy half the time. Now they're more and more crazy. They don't even care about whether we get in a nuclear war. They're not of sound mind. So we have to take the parental responsibility and get back to this problem-solving mode. Start with what we need to accomplish. We have terrible transportation in the United States, right? Why don't we address that? How was it done in the past? Oh, conservatives say we don't want to spend money. Liberals say we don't like industry. Well, how did we do these things in the past? Anthracite coal was developed, smokeless. That was good. Mm-hmm. That gave us the ability to make iron and steel. And we did things to solve problems on purpose. We built canals and we built railroads. The first railroads were designed by the Army engineers, assigned by President John Quincy Adams. Why don't we do that now? Why don't we have modern railroads? Why don't we have the space program again? I think South Korea they're doing things I don't know whether it's the moon or Mars now. What about the USA? Why don't we go back to predominance and preeminence, put it that way, in these fields and cooperate with these other countries? We have no difference of interest, fundamental interest, with China or with Russia.
It sounds
think about that. What's the difference between us and them? You say their government is a dictatorship. Well, what's the interest of the country? First of all, they've accomplished great things. They took hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We did that in the past. We don't do it now. People going into poverty. Why don't we make the great accomplishments
at the helm,
so we can boast about something?
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like these same people that basically led the South into a slave economy are doing the same thing today. They're sort of withholding or controlling these. I don't even know if they would be technological advances. I think these are just technology that we probably had 100 years ago, but they're not allowing the slaves to have that. They want to keep us on a global plantation, or at least a national plantation, while the rest of the world advances. They're keeping the slaves here, and I think Gerald Celente says in Slavelandia, they want to keep us on plantation, but it looks like they're doing that through technological means, much the same way they did in the 1800s with the South. And they're saying, okay, well, you can only have slave labor oh, whoops, now we got the cotton gin. What in the world? And that we got the steam engine. Well, how the heck did that happen? You know, I mean, am I close here? Is that what the heck's going on?
If you let's start with the people that made the great progress. Just think about Kennedy. His idea of the space program started with his analysis of the problem between the United States and the Soviet Union. We had an arms race with missiles to carry nuclear weapons. And, he learned that is going towards a tragic end. That's not in America's interest. He also saw that the industries were starting to go down. He tried to put in an investment tax credit to improve the steel industry. That is where you give money, you have a tax break if the industry invests in improvement of the industry, new research and development, say. And the steel owners did not want that. Why? Because they were not industrialists. They were Wall Street freaks like the J.P. Morgan Company. They were opposed philosophically and politically to the industrial progress of the USA because it makes people uppity. It makes people too confident. It makes the ordinary person into a citizen. They don't want that. So he saw this as a problem. The United States was becoming weak under this change of philosophy, away from industry, away from higher wages. And so he said, okay, how can we draw on the strength that we have, where we've developed this missile technology, these weapons, and some industries that are still thriving, the arms industry. Why don't we do something with that's in our national interest? Because what we're going towards is going to be a disaster. So he's proposing that we do a great breakthrough on the science of space travel and related things, miniaturization, computers, all that came out of this effort. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, let's have a détente with the Soviet Union. We feel that we can thrive in that, and they might even, have trouble with that if we're on peaceful terms with them, because that opens up communication. Reagan had that same idea with the so-called Star Wars. He wanted to use anti-missile defense with lasers to prevent nuclear attack, and he wanted to share that with the Russians. The Russians turned it down, the communists. But our national interest is in developing our power. And that doesn't mean war power. It means our power to defend ourselves. You need strong industry, strong science, you need a strong military. But you don't get that by threatening war all over the world. That's insane. That's a form of complete insanity. It's like a drunk who is armed to the teeth and is not using any sense. That's where we are right now. Mm-hmm. Nothing that we do is in our national interest. No threats. Look at the sanctions that we have against all these different countries. That's a form of terrorism. It's hurting the people in these countries. What's the point of sanctions against Russia? Oh, we want to improve their behavior. No, you don't. That's not the purpose of it. If you want to improve their behavior, then engage with them in joint activity for mutual benefit. That improves their behavior right away. So this is a challenge for people who want to survive. And, you were talking before the show about, a Christian education for children. It's a Christian point of view. If you want to survive, the law of nature that human beings have inherited is that you have to love your neighbor as yourself. That's a strict economic law as well. You have to pay good wages, or you're doomed in your industry. You have to have good citizens, and that means you have to have a peaceful society.
Yeah.
We worry about the southern border with waves of migrants coming across, desperate to try to get a better life. No one in the national limelight is discussing how to solve that problem. No one.
Nope.
Why not improve the countries where they're trying to escape from? Why do they have to suffer under terrorists, under drug pushers, all of whose money is in international banks that are resident in New York and London or offshore? Why don't we attack that system, that banking system? Mm-hmm. Why don't we work with these countries to develop industry, modern conditions, and so that people could have decent jobs and raise their families and not be forced for survival to flee their countries? Because the Anglo-American establishment is opposed to America's national interest. America's national interest would be for those countries to become modern powers.
Yeah.
Like Japan became, like China became. And why not? Isn't that better than having, people that want to make war on us?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I'll throw this out there because I know our time is running short, but back to the Christian ethos of this, I think hope is one of those intrinsic values that perhaps that baby boomer generation was that last generation that had hope. Because I think ever since then, there's been a gradual decline, and linking it up to the industrialization. I think it's because that industrialization has been slowly stripped away. So it takes away the value that a steel worker might have had. I'm making this steel, I'm putting it on this Ford, and it's gonna go across the country, go across the nation. I mean, even into the military with the completely unjustified wars from Vietnam on. I mean, we could say that the others were as well, but I mean, just completely unsanctioned, being a bit crude, kind of just urinating in the wind for the sake of it. I think we've seen that with the workforce. We've seen that with the military. And I think the chickens have come home to roost, where we see exceedingly high incidences of suicide, of self-harm, of drug use, of spousal abuse, of just depraved, right. Insanity on the highest realms here. And going back to what you said at kind of the very beginning, it coincides with the art, because the art's gone from this beautiful Van Gogh or this beautiful classical piece of music to just this crucifix in urine and just all this insanity at the Super Bowl halftime shows. I mean, I know that's coming up soon. It'll be another occultic ritual on live TV. But I mean, I think all that kind of connects dots into that industrialization, into that loss of hope and that loss of...
Why don't we conclude this as parents? I'm a grandfather. You're a parent.
Yeah.
Why don't we conclude this by assigning a little homework for people?
All right.
So I would say, let's take up these cases in Africa and have people take a look at them themselves. In Ethiopia, you have what's called the Grand Renaissance Dam, great electrification project. There's other projects for water to Transaqua, I think it's called, to bring water from wet areas to dry areas in Africa. Nigeria just built this tremendous modern deep water port to help their economy. And they're helped, and other countries are getting nuclear power plants. They're helped by China and Russia. My question is, for people to decide, are those projects and the purpose for the projects is the right of those people to rise in their status and skills. Are those a good thing, a good idea? Don't start with, well, we hate China and Russia. Start with, what are the needs, and do these kind of projects fit that need? Think of it for yourself. Mm-hmm. Look it up. Yeah. See what's going on. Why would the United States make attacks against the Ethiopian government if they're under attack from senseless rebels when they're trying to build up some modern civilization? This is where we fell down in our approach to the American Indians in the West. When we built the Transcontinental Railway, we displaced the Plains Indians from their way of life. We destroyed the buffalo herds by just completely cutting it in half. At that time, and in the next 20 years, we should have built up the West, Montana, Idaho, Nevada, and the whole West, with hundreds of thousands of farms and cities and industries to build up wealth producing capabilities. But we didn't do that. We never really settled the West in the way it should have been, the way Lincoln and these other people wanted to do. We would have had immense opportunities for the Indians in that culture. Yes, their way of life, their older way of life was destroyed, especially the Plains Indians. Mm-hmm. So we owed it to them to offer this kind of opportunity. And we did not do that. Because we did not build up our own capabilities. Teddy Roosevelt closed the frontier. He said there's no water out there. You can't populate those areas. You can't live in Montana. Baloney. Solve the problems. Build up modern times. There's a great man I'm going to talk about in the second volume, William J. Palmer, who built the industries in Colorado. He was for a civilized West. He wanted to solve the problems there with... he built the city of Colorado Springs. He built the steel industry out there. He built the National Railway of Mexico, and the Rio Grande and Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. So he wanted no saloons. He wanted modern cities where people were thinkers and skilled workers.
What a concept.
Now he's attacked for bringing coal out of the coal mines because that's not natural. It changes the environment. Well, what was he trying to do? He's trying to make life better, right? Yeah. So this is the way problem solving stops crime, stops us from committing crimes, and allows us to do right and not be fearful. So instead of going back and forth about how terrible these silly cultural crazy people have made our civilization, let's see how we can do justice to the people of the world and improve their lives. And then that way you get some excitement about the future. Kids can be engineers, they can be astronauts, they can do all kinds of things for the betterment of themselves and their families.
That's what we need. I mean, that Kennedy quote, the rising tide raises all ships. I mean, we need to bring that hope back to America. We got to bring it back to the world. But I mean, good grief, we at least need to have a functioning infrastructure here too.
Okay, well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anton. And we got to do a part 2 of this. I feel like we barely scratched the surface today. Good grief. I'd love to speak with you again. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, why don't you get up a list of questions and we could have a good set to. Very good.
That sounds wonderful. Well, if you'll stick around for about 20 seconds, I will close things up and say goodbye to you off the air.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. Well, folks, good grief. If you missed any of that, shame on you. Let me get this off the screen there. If you missed any of that, please go back and listen to it again. I highly recommend taking notes. A wonderful guest, wonderful information that I'm sure you're not going to hear from most of the outlets. So, as I always say, you can't do everything, but you can do something. Please get out there and do your part. Until next time, I'll see you sooner than later in the Anomic Age.
Thank you for listening to The Anomic Age, a John Age project. For past shows, further info, and to comment, go to anomicage.com. That's ANOMICAGE.com. Till next time, thank you for listening to The Anomic Age. Thank you.